Okay, so welcome to the final part of class lectures for today. We're going to talk about Pauline Boss's notion of the trauma and complicated grief of ambiguous loss. Um, Again, another kind of loss that brings uh, the past, that brings death into the present. But again, you might be asking yourself, what are the distinctive ways we understand loss of this type? What makes it ambiguous, and how is this different from anticipatory grief or chronic sorrow, which we've just been talking about? Um, and in the background, you get to see some fancy paintings done by Carolyn Helsel, so that only adds to our experience together. So, Boss, really, her emphasis is on the caregiver's experience of physical presence with psychological absence. And that's a progressive, kind of chronic or long term experience in which, so caregivers, this is something that I've had a lot of experience with in my own family, but caregivers face a lot of chronic stress, and some of those stresses are due to just the physical impacts of taking care of a loved one, or their giving up other things in order to take care of a loved one, giving up careers or finances, and the stresses that puts on their life. Um, but there also are other kinds of questions that caregivers often raise, and I'll just share some of these from my own reflection. Um, Caregivers face diseases that are black holes that suck energy away. They face the loss of a peer and also have a need for witnesses. They also might face a degree of survivor's guilt. So they might be asking, why not me? And there also is a kind of anxiety that comes from being constantly on call when you're a caregiver. You don't feel like you can ever be far away from the phone for long. And then if you hang around enough to ask a caregiver some deep questions, you might also hear about some of their feelings of, would my family take care of me if I was incapacitated in the same way? And this becomes especially important if you take gender into account. And then caregivers might also be asking a question like, where is my loved one now? Where did all those memories go? And so the questions of caregivers then are moments for theological reflection that I think you could use Boss's notion of ambiguous loss to help you interpret. In ambiguous loss, what heals and what helps is really naming that ambiguity for Boss. And the distinctive emphasis in her approach is on the relational bonds. So Boss is really interested in how diseases like dementia, for example, again, there's a close connection between Boss and Rando here. Diseases like dementia really challenge the relational or attachment frameworks of someone's life, so much so that they might need to revise their attachments because of a loss. For Boss, this kind of loss includes a kind of caregivers can become depressed. You want to challenge the idea that there's a closure to this kind of loss, but instead there's kind of a gradual slipping away that's full of confusion. And another challenge is that society has little patience for these kinds of long-term losses, or they have a very narrow bandwidth for it. And so Boss says, what happens if society doesn't recognize this loss is that it becomes what they call disenfranchised, which is a term from the legal literature, but it becomes disenfranchised grief when no one can claim that grief any longer. And so there's a loss that's kind of doubled because nobody is witnessing to it. I think that Boss's treatment for this kind of illness is naming the ambivalence. So she wants to help people say, my loved one is here and my loved one is also not here. My loved one is both present and not present at the same moment. I think that people who are going through dementia themselves and that are in the role of the patient have a different set of theological questions They might be asking, like, who will I be when all these markers of identity are gone? And I also think I might challenge Boss's notion that the person is gone a little bit and ask about whether or not God ultimately holds the memories of people with dementia in a way that will finally allow them to be revealed. So I've been thinking about the passage from Colossians 3:1 that says our lives are hidden with Christ in God, and then when Christ, who is our life, is revealed, our lives also will be revealed. So I wonder if there's a sense in which people with dementia don't just simply lose their memories, but like John Swinton says, they're actually remembered by God in ways that we can't actually see in the present. All that aside, because some people might not have that experience theologically, Boss says it's very important to try to surround people facing ambiguous loss with as much community as possible. Keep up with rituals and traditions. People need some kind of mentoring and some kind of mastery, and they also need some kind of sponsorship in this loss. So if a loss could be the physical presence with the psychological absence, they'll need a lot of caregivers around them who understand that journey, perhaps themselves, which is why caregiver support groups for things like Alzheimer's and dementia can be so powerful, provided people can regulate their own senses of distress and provide witnesses to one another. So the big ideas from Boss's article is that ambiguous loss, like dementia, is ambiguous, and it involves relationally changing the bonds of attachment during the life with the person. So it involves a grief that's happening in the present, and the part of the treatment for ambiguous loss is saying it's ambiguous. So saying we don't understand where this person is, but we also believe this person is there still. So it's kind of proclaiming a faith with the person in the midst of a mystery. But what Boss wants to draw our attention to is that this kind of loss is traumatic and long-term, and it's full of confusion, in part because there's not enough space allowed for the expression of that ambiguous loss. So sociological ambivalence about people with dementia and other kinds of illnesses mean that people who are grieving this loss get less support than they might. So you might be thinking, who are the people in my community today who are struggling with ambiguous loss? Physical presence of a loved one, but psychological absence. And what are the distinctive grief approaches, including naming that ambivalence, naming that ambiguity, and allowing for it? And then what are the specific strengths of faith or resources from your faith tradition that speak to that moment of loss, of constant letting go? So if you were going to normalize this experience of caregiving with an exhausted primary caregiver with a spouse for dementia who had dementia, how might you go towards that experience of ambiguous loss? You might begin by saying, sometimes your loved one seems to be here and sometimes he seems to not be here, something like that. You might talk about how how that relationship with that loved one has changed over the years as a result of their illness. You might go towards these places of pain that have to do with the ambiguity of the loss. Again, I think what we need to hear right now is the caregiver's lament in situations of ambiguous loss. And everything we can do to educate ourselves about these different types of loss then will help us be able to hear someone's crying out to God, someone's struggle, someone's questions, someone's relational ambivalence in ways that are going to be helpful for them and healing for them ultimately. So again, we're going to have, this is the third of 3 different short lectures on the readings, and then we're going to have some time in class on Monday morning between 9 a.m. and 10:30 where we can see one another over the computer and talk about some of these ideas and put them into practice. So what's distinctive about ambiguous loss for Paula Voss then is physical presence but psychological absence. It's an ongoing nature of traumatic loss that revises one's attachments, and it's by nature ambiguous. So someone can both be there and not be there, and somehow naming that ambiguity is crucial to the healing approach to ambiguous loss. Okay, thank you so much, and thanks for hanging in for all these videos. Okay, be well.